Tonight, I'm going to be doing a natural edge goblet demonstration. Okay, we're going to try to keep the bark on. Let me show you some examples before we get started. Let's see, let's go to this one here. Okay, so this is my practice piece from this afternoon. This piece of wood is the piece I'm going to use to demonstrate on. It's already got a tenon on it and it's in the chuck, but this is the piece that I'm going to try to, this is my target piece. I can show things like, I'm not going to do a captured ring tonight, but you're certainly able to do that. This is one option. I tend to favor these kinds of arrangements at the top of the stem. And one of the reasons I do that is my piece is actually a little bit deeper into the stem area here. A lot of the goblets I turn them wet. So this is another example. This piece is cherry. The techniques you see tonight will let you get this thin on the stem. And I will show techniques tonight that will show you how to get this thin in the walls too. Okay, this is a piece of silver maple.
Hey
Questions?
Matt, Matt, your microphone is breaking up.
I'm sorry to hear that. I don't know how. Can you hear? How is this any better?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Any questions so far?
No.
All right. I think that this is a piece of Bradford pear. I'm not sure. I've got a couple of things to look out for. I've got a interesting sort of a bark issue here, and I've got a knot here. So hopefully they will not cause problems, but we'll see. So the first thing that these are some other pieces that I've turned. The first thing that I do is I turn a tenon. So this is a cutaway look at the inside of the goblet in general. And the first thing I'm doing is I'm making a tenon and getting it into the chuck. So I've already done that to save time. We all know how to do that. So these are the steps that I'm going to do now. The first step is to turn the outside of the bowl. The second step is to hollow the bowl, removing tailstock support while I do that. And I'll talk about that when I get there. And then after I do step 2, which is hollowing the bowl, I then will bring up some tailstock support for the inside of the bowl, and then I'll begin working towards the headstock. And this is important, especially if you want to be thin, because you need that the bulk of the wood at the headstock to support what you're doing. And then the last thing I'm going to do is shape the base and part it off. Okay, any questions so far in any of this?
No, it's great.
All
Great
right.
slide.
All right, thank you. I will switch to here and start turning. So the first thing I'm going to do is shape the bowl, and I'm going to shape it up here. And I'm going to use my my deep fluted bowl gouge for that. And the shape that I tend to do is I tend to do a shape that's got a sort of a tulip look at the top of it. And the reason I do that is because so that I can get a little bit more of the bark in here. Because I think that if you're trying to make a piece like this, I think that having the bark on it and having more of the bark helps accentuate the piece. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to gradually, this is ever so slightly getting smaller as I go to here, and I'm going to stop about here when I'm turning the bowl so I know where to stop the inside hollowing. Okay.
Sounds good.
Deep fluted bowl gouge. And people ask how fast I turn. I like to turn fast. So often I will tell people that I'll turn it till the lathe starts walking around and then turn it down a little. So one of
Always
the
turn
things,
it up. Always turn it up a little bit to get past that resonation point.
yep. So one of the things that I'm doing here is I'm setting the cut up at a shearing angle before I even hit the wood. So I'm riding the cut. I'm already cutting before I get to the wood. And I just lost a big piece of the bark there. But it's shearing before I get there. So what I've done here is I've defined the bottom of my bowl, and now I'm ready to go in and start hollowing. So yeah, the bark was head issues.
Never fails.
Yeah, so I'm gonna get a little crazy here with the augmentation. So because I've got bark missing, I'm gonna scorch it up a little bit. Maybe if I can get this thing to light. Maybe not. All right, have to do it another time. It's cold here, guys. The wind chill outside is only 13 degrees, so uh, my butane lighter isn't lighting. Okay, so before I take away tailstock support, I want to tighten my chuck. So I'm going to tighten and tighten. Even if your wood is dry, the wood is still going to move and the chuck jaws are still going to compress it a little. Before you take away the tailstock support, you want to make sure everything's really tight, because it don't have any support now when you get out here. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my skew and I'm going to make a little dimple. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a drill and do a depth do a depth finding on it. So this is a skew. I'm using it as a scraper. I'm putting the point in first like this. We'll switch to this going here, going in like this. And I'm just going to make a little dimple for the drill bit to register. That's all I'm doing. Now I'm going to go back to this view and I'm going to get out and I'm only going to want to go like that deep. So let's move this. Mark it. Questions?
So when you're drilling out the center, is it primarily to mark the depth, or is it primarily to get rid of that center mass that's barely turning, or all the above?
It is a little bit trying to get rid of the center mass that's always turning, and you could certainly use a Forstner bit if you want to, if you want to get, remove a little bit more of the wood. But it's primarily just to set the depth, and you don't even have to do this step. I'm just doing it to show it, and because it makes the demo go smoother. But and I have certainly turned these without doing this step. But and I'm not going to do the Forstner bit step because it's more interesting if you turn it. And remember to move, pull your drill out and remove the chips off, and so those things don't get stuck and you don't put too much pressure on your piece. Again, there's hardly any support for this right now when you're out here. You got to be real careful with your cuts and what you do, because piece is unsupported. So one of the things I will point out at this point is if I've got a cut that's going into the headstock this direction, that's a much safer cut than if I'm going out in either direction, because this way or that way it exercises a lot of leverage on the piece to pull it out of the chuck. But if I'm going into the headstock, then the pressure is going into the headstock and it doesn't have that same leverage that'll pull the piece out. You can still pop it out if you get too crazy, but you're taking light cuts here, light shearing cuts the whole way. Any other questions on this right now?
No, go ahead, Matt.
All right. Well, hopefully I haven't put anybody to sleep. This stands a very real chance of coming off the lathe at this point, so get your catcher's mitts up. I'm going to keep using the deep fluted bowl gouge. I'm going to use cuts. One of the cuts is a shearing cut into the center like this, and the other cut is a cut that's also a shearing cut with the tool tip raised, very gently pulling outwards. All these cuts are very, very light. Okay. And they're both shearing cuts. And I think of them as I think of this cut the outward cut as a blending cut. Okay. And when I say that is I'm going to be working my way from the rim
It's like you froze up, Matt.
guiding the bevel into the center, taking very fine shavings. And the blending cut, the pull cut, is you're blending previous cuts together to get the surface. So that cut looks like this, where I'm pulling it outwards towards the rim. I got a couple of cuts. And then I'm going to blend those cuts together to get thin. And that's how you get the truly thin rim. And this cut is a safer cut because you're riding the bevel and the pressure is going into the headstock. And again, these are light shearing cuts. What you don't want to do is you don't want to put any pressure on the thin walls at all. So here, I'm just taking a very, very light shearing cut into the center. And then I can very gently and I'm not trying to hog this fast at all. I'm just taking a very light cut and I'm making sure I remove chips so I can see what I'm doing. And I'm trying to blend the cuts together. Ideally, especially if you're turning this wet, you don't, once you get the wall thickness where you want it up here, you don't want to come back to it. So I'm using the push cut to shape the bottom to that drilled hole in the center. And then I'm using the pull cut to blend the surfaces together. And they're very, very light, especially as I get close to the rim. I'm going to turn on this other light here I've got, and hopefully it won't wash things out too much. And I typically do this a lot faster, so I'm going to turn it up. And I'm watching, like here, I'm watching the outer contours of my piece out here. So because I don't want to, clearly I don't want to break through my rim, and I don't want to get too thin. And then I can go in here. And then I can keep coming back out. Whoa. And let me change where my tool rest is. So that's where I am so far. Hopefully you guys can see that.
Yes.
All right. Make sure that everything spins good. So, but having that hole drilled in the center really does give you a great starting spot for that pull cut to the outer rim. And then I blend it when I get there. Very, very light cut. All right. Change where my tool rest is again. Trouble getting in there. Let me check my wall thicknesses here. I can get a little thinner. Yeah, about 3/16. Let's get it a little thinner. All right, that's pretty good. I'm pretty happy with that. So what I'm going to do now is bring up tailstock support. Switch to this view here. I am going to use a rubber Chucky no-nose Chucky. Looks like this. It's on my live center. It spins. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to just bring it up just so it's just barely touching in there and lock it down and then give it a little bit of a, just a ever so slight pressure. One of the things I'm doing, the primary reason I'm doing this is if I'm going to get thin on the stem, I don't want this to wobble on me. Okay. So if I've got pressure in and I start getting thin on the stem, that pressure is going to cause that wood to flex, to bow, introduce chatter, and maybe break the stem. And I don't want to do that. So that's why this is light. It's primarily to keep this bit from moving around, from wobbling back and forth. Okay. Questions on that?
All
Okay.
good.
Okay. Now, before I go further, I want to define where the rest of my goblet's going to be. So I need to define the bottom, and I want to try and cut this bark out if I can. So I'm going to define the bottom here, and then I'm going to define the top of the bottom. So I'm going to define this bit here where I'm going to part it off, and then I'm going to define this. And what that will do is it'll let whatever's left, it'll define whatever's left be my stem. Okay. So I'm going to take a small parting tool here, and I'm going to set that up right now. So I'm going to come in above this bad bark here. And then I'm going to come in on the other side of it to set the top of the bottom. I probably have lost all the bark now, so that's too bad. The bark was a little sketchy. Okay, so what that tells me is that tells me where the bottom of my piece is here and the top of the bottom. And the rest of it here is stem. I'm going to work my way down this direction. So I'm going to take my deep fluted bowl gouge and I'm going to start shaping. Always cutting downhill. Okay. We're now going to shape the bottom of the bowl and begin setting up the features. So for this cut, I'm using a detail gouge, which is essentially a small spindle gouge that's been reground to make it into a detail gouge. And on this is a spindle gouge. All I did was I swept back the shoulders and I steepened the grind a bit. Okay. And I use this a lot in a lot of my fine detail on these pieces. Any questions so far? Any questions? Any more questions?
Nothing noted.
Okay, so one of the cuts, I'm going to show this. Let me see if I can zoom here in on this here. One of the cuts that I'm going to show here is a cut where I'm using, and I'll use a smaller tool than this probably, but I'm going to be on top of the stem, and I'm going to be cutting like this. I'm riding the bevel and cutting with the flute, but it's at a steep angle, so I'm getting a shear cut. I'm getting a clean shear cut like that. Okay. And you can see how shiny this is, what kind of cut I'm getting. And I'll switch to that tool in a minute, but I could do it with this tool and I could keep doing, I want to put another little bead in here first. Clean that up a little bit. Put a bead in here. Then put a little feature here to go out into the stem. Ah. Okay. Now, part of the thing that I'm doing here is I'm rid of the material so I can get down inside there and get my tools down in here to make the cuts I want to make. Now this is the key, one of the keys to making a very thin stem. I'm taking a little bit of wood with each cut, but not a lot of wood, and they're very sheer cuts. So, and I can keep making those cuts and I can keep going smaller and smaller and smaller. Just taking a little bit of wood at a time. I'm not putting any pressure. If I put any pressure this way, as this gets thinner, any pressure this way stands a much bigger chance of snapping that. So I don't want to put any pressure on it. I want to I want to ride the bevel gently and let the tool edge do the work. So please feel free to ask any questions you might have at any point.
When should you finish the cup?
Well, I do most of my finishing off the lathe. So ideally, if you're going to sand, I mean, I can sand it. I can sand the outside right now. So I could sand the cup right now. Okay.
Right.
And then finish it if I was finishing on the lathe. But I do almost all my finishing off the lathe. I'm spraying spar urethane, or I'm applying, say, water lux or something like that. I'm sorry? By wiping it on or anything like that. So, but ideally you want to finish the cup before you start working on the rest of it.
Okay.
You don't want to have to come back to the cup, especially not when the stem is thin. Okay. So I'm going to switch to a small deep fluted bowl gouge. And it's very similar to my large one. It's just not as big. Okay. And the reason why I do that is because it's more delicate and I make lighter cuts when I do it. some glasses on so I can see what I'm doing. So, and this is where I'm also making those cuts where I'm riding the bottom bevel at a steep angle and I'm getting a shear, and I can keep going. Now, one of the games I play with my goblets is I got to looking at this critically, and I realized that if you try to make the stem perfectly straight, then any slight aberration that isn't perfectly straight really jumps off the piece at you. However, if you make the whole stem curved and there's a slight discrepancy, nobody can tell. So I make my stems all curved. I'm not saying my stems aren't perfectly straight. They aren't. But any sort of discrepancies, they don't show up. And I can keep going thinner on this piece if I want. I'm not putting any pressure on this. Switch to the detail gouge. So, and I also like to put a little sort of feature under here like that. Sort of round that off. This is not the only way. This is not the right way. There's a whole bunch of different designs. I encourage everybody to look at their cabinets and look at their start with your wine glasses in your cabinets or your water glasses or your fine china or whatever you got. So one of the things that I like is I like to see my goblets sort of floating off the table. So I like a little bit of a bevel. So I'm going to, with this little parting tool, I'm going to sort of come in and underneath this and put a little bit of a bevel on the bottom of this piece. But what that means is I have to start the bit where I'm undercutting it inside that little bevel so that I've got a little bevel on the bottom. What does that mean? Well, if you look at this piece here, and I don't know if you can actually see it, but there is that bevel is here, okay? And then it's undercut starting inside of that bevel so that it sits flat. Any questions on that?
No, but I got a question on finishing, Matt.
Yes, sir.
Can you actually spray a finish when it's freezing in your shop?
No, I don't do that inside, Jim.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I have a quote unquote finishing room in my basement. Okay.
Okay. Yeah,
And,
you
and
had before, and I was
yeah,
wondering.
it's inside where it's warm.
Okay.
And what it is, it's basically a small greenhouse. It's big enough for me to stand on. It's got some shelves in it.
Oh,
I've
neat.
got a duct fan that goes outside through a basement window. It's
Yeah.
sealed, and I put painter's tape over the greenhouse so
Okay.
that it's all sealed, and nobody complains of the lacquer smell or whatever else I've got going on. And it's dust, it keeps it relatively dust free.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm doing it where it's warm.
Okay. Well, I never tried it. I never even thought of it. Tell you the truth.
So, and I am undercutting this. I don't know if you all can tell from the camera angles, but I am coming at this at an angle. I'm undercutting Goblet so that it sits on the rim. That's not what I wanted to do. That's what I wanted to do. Okay, so there's my little goblet. I bumped my camera too. So there's the goblet that I just turned. Any other questions? And I've got to clean up the nub on the bottom, but that's so there's you can see some of the how thin it is at the edge. And I've got some post-processing to do to clean up some of this up here on the rim and a little bit of scorching to do to clean up the bark that came off.
It looks
Very nice.
great.
Well, thank you. Any
On your-
questions?
Matt, on your bark, would it have been more beneficial to soak the exterior of the bark that you wanted to save with CA?
Yes,
Or is
absolutely.
it just, oh, okay.
Yeah, and if you can see that this one that I did earlier, I did do that. There is I don't know if you can see the CA stains, but there's CA, and what I did I want the CA to be on the wood and from the solid wood into the bark, and I do that
Right.
before I even start on the center.
Yep.
And then the next step is to come in and once you've got your inside hollowed, then you do it on the inside too, and you do the
Yep.
same down here too.
Okay. And then what kind of wood was
Nice.
it? Was that box elder?
I think that this is Bradford pear.
Bradford
It-
pear, that's
I
right.
pulled it out of my pile. I got stacks of
Okay.
wood all over the house, so it's
Right. It was thawed out, right?
yeah. I wait. We had a storm last spring. It's actually been sitting around for about a year. We had a storm last spring that brought a bunch of trees down, and
Yeah.
I scored some basswood, some linden, and some Bradford pear and a bunch of other stuff. So
Hey, Matt,
yes, sir.
I use a steady rest when I'm working on that bow part, and that really helps.
Okay. Well, I do have string steadies, and I have used them. One of the goblets I did that had a 1/16 of an inch stem, and it was 14 inches tall. So in that case, I certainly would recommend using a steady rest or a string steady. But as you can see, I could get these done without having to do that, if I don't get too crazy. So, I mean, this is like, I don't know, 8 inches tall or whatever it is. So this one that I just made. So it's, it's
neat.
doable as long as you're careful.
Yeah, go ahead, Craig. Ask your question.
Oh, yeah. No, I was just gonna say, with the CA glue, what I've been doing to keep it from bleeding onto parts I don't want it is putting some sanding sealer down, let that dry. And then it kind of blocks a little bit of that CA glue bleeding into
Yep,
soft wood or anything.
Yep, that's a good idea. One of the issues you're dealing with, I mean, you'd have to be carefully applying that sanding sealer, because one of the issues you're dealing with is that you want that CA glue to go into the wood to lock the bark on. So you
Well,
don't
yeah,
want
I'm talking about doing on the edges of where you don't want it to bleed too.
I mean, you can certainly carefully apply sanding sealer. The sanding sealer I use is spray. It's really kind of hard to do that. So I hear you. This will sand off, so I'm not too worried about it. But I do want it into the wood to help lock in the spongy wood and the
Yeah.
bark. So I could get the CA glue. I can make it a CA finish, or I can, use the CA glue and carefully wipe it on so it just looks like it's a natural part of the wood. It doesn't look like it's obviously CA glue.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
So, but yeah, usually, I mean, once you get a good finish in there, usually you can't see it anyway, but it's more important that, while you're turning it, to get that to lock in the bark and the spongy, whatever that spongy wood is called. It's got a name.
Punky.
Ambien.
So, I've also got one more slide here, just some more examples and where you can find them. So again, start with your own kitchen cabinets, so your glass or champagne glass for shape ideas. So everything on this, all those little goblets on the left-hand picture on this page, they're all less than 1 inch in diameter and less than 1.5 inches tall.
Wow.
So when I've got extra wood at the bottom of a piece that I'm turning, I make a goblet or I make a bowl or I make a little vase. I experiment with shapes. Doesn't cost you anything. Extra project wood, right?
Yeah.
So, and you know, eventually, I mean, I had a show where I sold like 60 of these things at $5 a piece. So the small ones. So, you know, you never know. So sometimes they'll sell too. So
Mm.
Why do you use a bowl gouge instead of a spindle gouge
at which point?
for the majority of the turning?
Well, you can't use using a spindle gouge to hollow is kind of unsafe. Okay. I use the bowl gouge for I don't use a roughing gouge or a spindle gouge for almost anything except the details. I rough with the deep fluted bowl gouge because it's an extremely versatile tool. And as you saw, I can make one cut and get my shape right from the, you know, right from the raw wood, from the outer bark. I can, you know, with 2 cuts, I made the bowl shape. And it's an extremely versatile tool. I can roll it. It's my favorite tool to use, and I can get the shearing cuts with it very quickly. One of the things I like about that tool to rough with, especially, is that the amount of tool in the wood is much smaller than if I was using a spindle roughing gouge. So if I'm trying to create a shape, I have a lot more flexibility to refine that shape very quickly with that tool without screwing it up, because I've got a big piece of the tool in the wood. If that makes sense.
Matt, what's
Good
the
explanation.
smallest gouge that you're using? Because you said you went from one to a smaller one.
Yeah, let me switch to this camera here and I'll show you the difference. So this is my large deep fluted bowl gouge. Okay. I think it's 5/8 outer diameter.
Yep.
This is the small one. So, and I think it's like a 1/2 inch outer diameter. Okay. That's the difference. You
Okay.
guys can see that. So, and this is like, I mean, I used my deep fluted bowl gouge for almost everything. And I use the smaller one a lot, especially for details or thin turning. I use it on, say, making finials and stuff like that. So, and it's basically got the same grind as the other one. So, and I know that a number of manufacturers, I think this one is a Henry Taylor, but that I bought years ago. But I know that Thompson makes a smaller one. I've used a Thompson one because one of my students had one of those. It's a nice tool too. So there's a number of manufacturers who are making those tools. So
Yeah, I got one that's a 1/4 of an inch, and
there you go.
I
Do
just
you
wondered,
use it? Do you like it?
I haven't used it.
Well, there you go. Now you know how. So it's my favorite
Mhm.
tool to do fine detail with, like thin turnings, like on finials and stuff, because it gives you a lot of control. It's a very light tool. You can make very fine cuts with it. And I mean, I showed you how I got thin on the goblet stem with it. So, and this is the no-nose Chucky. It's from rubberchucky.com. So,
What's your grind on those gouges?
55 degrees approximately. Other questions?
No, nothing in the chat. And if anybody had a question that didn't get answered, now's your time to ask it.
Good
Great
job
demo,
there.
Matt.
Well,
Good job,
thank you.
Matt.
Thank you.
I'm,
Real nice.
Well,
I'm
thank you.
typically not much of a goblet guy, but I do like the natural edge at the top of those that you're doing. I just really like that. I may have to.
Yeah, I do too.
I
I'm
may
a
have to go to
fan.
the dark side.
They're not for everybody, but these do have Helmsman spar urethane finish on them, so you can drink out of them. So the people who love them really love them. But like I say, they're not for everybody.